Hey everyone, this is Paul Frölich's entry in Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism and the Soviet Union. This is located in Chapter 4, which is titled "From quote the Great Patriotic War end quote to the Structural Assimilation of Eastern Europe." I'm reading from the top of the page. That's 1941 to 1956. It's under the heading of interpretations, quote, without labels, end quote. So, here we are, let's party. Paul Frölich, who lived from 1884 to 1953, was a veteran of the German labor movement, who in the Weimar Republic had represented the KPD as a parliamentarian in the Reichstag, who later, in 1932, had joined the German Socialist Workers' Party. Frölich lived the life of an exile from 1934 to 50, first in France and later in the United States. Upon Frölich's return to the Federal Republic of Germany, Frölich joined the SPD and published, among others, in Funken, a journal to which Psychon also contributed. Psychon is also getting, I also just recorded his section from this book. I wanted to say that I also have it's a very short, and I don't really remember the contents of it, but it's a very short, article-length biography of Frölich. Talks a lot about his reflections on Russia once he was in exile in America. During the last years of Frölich's life, Frölich worked on a book about the nature of the Stalin regime. Fragments of this incomplete study were published only much later, but important elements of Frölich's theory became known already at the beginning of the 1950s. Through small contributions in the West German political press and Frölich's correspondence with other left-wing socialists, Frölich, in a letter to Roman Mozdalsky, called the Soviet Union, quote, a new historical phenomenon, end quote, and added, quote, the name for it will be found. Meantime, it suffices if one frames the question, end quote. Explain the origins of Stalinist dictatorship, like most authors, to an important extent with reference to the absence of socialist revolution in the West, but in contrast to most, Frölich deduced this absence from objective causes, not just in Russia, but also elsewhere. The preconditions for socialism as yet did not exist. The Russian Revolution therefore had to fail in its attempt to establish socialism. The result was, quote, an economic order which strives towards capitalist development, a statized planned economy. But it is one which has broken through capitalist barriers, a planned economy without capitalists, for which the capitalist laws no longer apply. And this planned economy is realized in a society with the most brute contradictions and barbaric methods of domination, which ultimately are the fruit of the unripeness for socialism. End quote, Paul Frölich. In the posthumously published fragments, which partly overlap with reflections published during his life, Frölich tries to gain more insight into the Soviet bureaucracy by investigating differences and similarities with, quote, classical, end quote, ruling bureaucracies, such as in Imperial China, setting out from the idea that apparently stable bureaucracies of the, quote, Chinese, end quote, type could only exist in relatively balanced social formations in which economic and social development remained little. He drew the conclusion that the Soviet bureaucracy was a phenomenon of quite a different order. In the society issuing forth from the October Revolution, Frölich perceived a combination of a number of precarious equilibria which would, in the shorter or longer term, become destabilized. Firstly, intermediate layers were lacking which could absorb and channel the contradiction between the bureaucratic, quote, machine, end quote, and the majority of the population. For example, the absolutist state continued to draw support for a long time from the aristocracy and from significant parts of the bourgeoisie in exploiting the rural population, the, quote, totalitarian, end quote, Soviet bureaucracy formed a unity of state apparatus, exploiter and oppressor. This forced the ruling stratum to a very brute and repressive regime, the position of which would be challenged as soon as the masses of the people began to mobilize. Secondly, the ruling bureaucratic layer was becoming more and more a closed elite, which reserved a monopoly of education for itself, and began to show the characteristics of a tightly knit caste. This had in time great consequences for the elite's capacity for action and resoluteness in policy. Quote, where the ability to rule becomes a secure privilege, the morality of its bearers inevitably dissipates. Willpower, the preparedness for great sacrifices, the reckless engagement of one's own personality, and certainly also an inflexibility in attitude as the ruling layer must become paralyzed. Governing becomes a routine. If, however, the machine becomes routinized, it becomes incapable of adapting to new conditions, end quote. Paul Frölich. Thirdly, the ossification of the elite led to a progressive bureaucratization. Not just the workers, but also various layers within the bureaucracy were deprived of their freedom of movement and possibilities for free initiative. Intrigue and servility then began to determine the code of conduct. Fourthly, the emergence of a powerful bureaucracy stifled every form of independent thought. Criticism became impossible. Rubber-stamped doctrinarism began to take over. The party, which in the old days had been a forum for profoundly searching discussions, degenerated to a mere collection of yes-men giving or taking orders. All these factors together meant that the non-socialist, quote, totalitarian, end quote, bureaucratic dictatorship in the non-capitalist planned economy was exceptionally vulnerable. Although the possibility could not be excluded that the regime would remain, quote, unshakable, end quote, for quite some time. Its downfall was deemed inevitable.